Hi everyone, and welcome to this video. In this video, I want to show you how to draw a realistic eye, and there are lots of different ways to approach drawing realistic eyes, and in this video I want to show you my method and talk about each step of the process, and I encourage you to pause the video whenever you need to follow along. In terms of the supplies I use for this drawing, I like to use a 2H graphite pencil for the sketch, then I used a 2B, a 4B and a 6B for the shading. I used blending sticks to blend and smooth the shading, and if you don't have blending sticks you could use cotton buds or a tissue, a brush or even your fingers. Any of these will be fine. Then I also used a Tombow Mono Zero eraser, which is just a small eraser, to add small highlights to the drawing. Any small eraser or any eraser with corners will work just fine. And at the end, I also decided to use a white GellyRoll pen for a few highlights. You don't particularly need this for this drawing, it's just a personal preference of mine. I like to add a few highlights at the end. And the paper I used is smooth Bristol board. But don't worry if you don't have these specific supplies. You can follow the steps in this video with any pencils and paper, and you'll be able to create something similar. As you can see, with the 2H pencil, I began by sketching some light guidelines, 1 horizontal and 3 vertical. And these lines help me to get the alignment correct, and later on they help with the symmetry of the iris and the pupil. And with these lines placed, you can see I started sketching the rough shape of the eye, similar to the shape of a lemon. And at this stage, I'm only using the 2H pencil, not using too much pressure, and keeping the lines light, so they're easily erasable. So first of all, the upper eyelid has a steeper curve than the lower eyelid, and you can see the outer corner of the eye is aligned where the horizontal and the vertical guidelines meet on the right side. Then you can see the inner corner of the eye is angled a bit more downwards, with the line of the upper eyelid passing through where the horizontal and the vertical guidelines meet on the left side. And so with the inner corner of the eye sketched just under the horizontal guideline, I then added the iris and the pupil. Making use of that central vertical line, this line really helps with symmetry and keeping the pupil placed at the centre of the iris. After that, I added another line along the lower eyelid, and then I defined the shape of both of the eyelids with some outlines above and below the eye. And at this stage I also added some outlines showing where I wanted to place highlights on the eye. It's good to know where you want to place the highlights before you start adding the shading, so you know where not to place the shading. And I just continued cleaning up these lines for a little while, making sure I was happy with the overall shapes before I started adding any shading. With the outlines completed, I then erased the guidelines, and that's the benefit of working with light line work to begin with. These lines were very easy to erase. And then it was time for me to start adding the shading, beginning with the white areas of the eyes, also known as the sclera. The shading doesn't have to be perfect at this stage. I just roughly added light shading with a 2B pencil, and it's important to consider where you imagine the light source to be shining from. In this case, I'm imagining the light is shining from the right, and I place the shading accordingly, with more shading on the left towards the inner corner of the eye. I then used a blending stick to smooth the shading, and in this drawing I decided that I didn't add enough shading on the left, so I added more with the 2B pencil and then used the blending stick again. And it's always a good idea to start with light shading and work your way up to darker shading. It's much easier to add more shading on top than it is to erase the darker shading and start again. I just took my time adding layers. I built up more shading in both corners of the eye as well, starting to define its shape. After that, I decided to add some dark shading to the pupil, and for this I'd recommend either a 4B or a 6B. And I made sure to leave the areas where I wanted to keep the highlights, and I defined their outlines a bit more, just to make sure I didn't lose them amongst the shading I was about to add to the iris. You'll notice that I added a zigzag pattern around the iris, and this is a general idea of the layout and the details I wanted to add to it. And after this I started adding some rough layers of shading with a 2B and then a 4B, using blending sticks between each layer. I then defined the zigzag pattern I added with even more shading, and I continued adding layers of shading on the top and the bottom of the iris. Then it was time for me to start using the small eraser to add some highlights all around the iris. And it looks strange at this stage, but these are just the initial layers. I promise it will make sense once I start adding more details with the 2B and the 4B pencils. Once the highlights were added, I used the pencils again, making sure they're sharpened for the finer details I wanted to add. I added fine lines going outwards from the pupil, and I made the shading slightly darker towards the centre. And then I also used the sharpened pencils to define the shapes of the highlights, continuing to imagine the light source shining from the right and how that would place more shadow on the left of each individual highlight. It's an effective way of creating lots of overlapping and interesting details. Don't worry too much about creating any specific details. I had reference photos in front of me, but I didn't copy them exactly. They gave me a good idea of the shading and the details I wanted to add, but I didn't need to reference the tiny details of the iris. Every eye is different, and that's what makes this so much fun, because with this general idea, you're able to freely add any intricate little details you want to add to the iris. And this is just a technique that I've been practicing, and I believe it could really help. I personally find this so much fun. With those details added, I then added more shading around the outer edges of the iris, blending this shading inwards with blending sticks on top of some of those details, and I then used the sharp leads to define some of the shapes in amongst this darkened shading. And after that, I added a more defined ring around the outside of the iris, and this is called the limbal ring. And I made sure to blend around the outside of this ring too, so it looks like it's actually connected to the white area of the eye. I continued to refine the details in this area for a while, sharpening up and refining the highlighted areas, and making use of contrast to add depth and define the different shapes. To match and I guess balance the darker shading I added to the iris, I decided to add even more shading to the corners of the eye, just adding some layers with the 2B and the 4B, and then blending that with a blending stick. And then it was time to add shading and details to the inner corner of the eye, adding some darker shading here, always thinking about the light source shining in from the right, and with that in mind, also adding some highlights. After this, I used a combination of sharpened 2H and 2B pencils to add some blood vessels to the white areas of the eye. And before moving on to the next stage, I also added some extra highlights around the right side of the eye with the small eraser. Next up, it was time for me to add the skin, and like the previous parts of this drawing, I started off by adding light areas of rough shading first with a 2B pencil, and blending that with blending sticks. Then I continued to add more layers of shading with both the 2B and a 4B pencil, always thinking about the light source and placing the darker shading on the left side. As I developed the shapes with the shading, it was also time for me to refine some of the edges around the eye itself, and so I used the sharpened lead of the 2B pencil to create nice clean lines. To create the skin texture, I like to start by adding some lines with the 2B pencil, looking at reference photos in front of me to get an idea of where to place them, but not referencing the photos exactly, just getting an idea of the direction the line should go. And then I also use the small eraser to add lines in a similar direction. After that, I use the blending stick on top of this area to fade those lines. Then I continued to add more layers using the same method. And I did this for all the areas of the skin on and around the eyelids. Another method that I like to use to make the skin texture look a bit more realistic, well, I like to get a small blending stick that I've already been using, and so it's still got some graphite on it, and I'll tap the blending stick in random patches to create variations in the skin tone. And I also tap the shading with a small eraser to create more texture and to also show patches where the light might be touching, and this works especially well near the darker shaded areas. You'll see that I use this technique near the inner corner of the eye. It was now time for me to add the eyelashes, and I started off by using the 2B pencil, and I took my time placing them on the upper eyelid, always looking at the reference photos to get an idea of the length I wanted them to be, and to also get an idea of the direction they go in, considering we're viewing this eye from the front. After adding the first layer with the 2B pencil, I then added more thickness to some of the eyelashes, and I recommend using either a 4B or a 6B pencil for this. I followed the same technique for the eyelashes on the lower eyelid as well. There generally isn't as many eyelashes on the lower eyelid, and they're a little bit shorter. At this stage, I was now approaching the finishing touches, and I used the small eraser to add highlights along some of the eyelashes, and this really helped in the darker shaded areas to add a bit of a 3D effect to the eyelashes, making them stand out in front of that shading with a highlight, making use of contrast to add depth. And you'll see I also added a bit of shading along the upper eyelid, at the base of the eyelashes. This next part of the drawing is just my own personal preference. I wanted to add some finer highlights with a Sakura GellyRoll pen, and I added highlights to the inner corner of the eye along with the lower eyelid, and I generally added dots of highlighting where I felt light would be reaching as it's shining from the right side. I also added highlights along some of the eyelashes, and this helped to add more contrast. And for the last step, while sharpening up the details of this drawing, I added the reflection of the eyelashes along the top of the highlights. And after that, this drawing was completed. I really hope this video is helpful. I love working on graphite drawings like this, and I wanted to try and share the process in a longer video like this. So be sure to let me know what you think of this, and also let me know if you attempted to follow this tutorial. I would love to see your drawings. And also feel free to leave any suggestions for future art videos I could try. Your suggestions are incredibly helpful. If you're interested in seeing more art videos like this, then feel free to subscribe to this channel, and any likes or shares on this video are hugely appreciated. If you want to follow and support my art progress, then be sure to check out the links in the description for my Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and Patreon. And once again, thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for the support. I really, really appreciate it. I hope you're all doing okay, and I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you all soon.